and welcome everyone. So, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're enjoying the Pioneer Annual Leaders Conference 2021 so far. I've personally really enjoyed it. I've been in the building a lot, actually. I'm helping with some of the visuals and the words and a few other moderator things. So it's been great to actually meet together, even in this online space in the weird world that we find ourselves in now. But yeah, I'd love to welcome you to our seminar today. It's on leveraging data for the kingdom during COVID-19, and we're so glad you could join us. First of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Nathaniel. I'm part of the community at Open Heaven Church in the Midlands region. I've been part of the community of Open Heaven for 7.5 years now in the town. And yeah, Loughborough really feels like my home now. So I love this place dearly. And so the stuff that we were sharing this morning in the talks was really something that resonated with my heart in terms of loving our community and getting to know people and serve them really well. So yeah, a bit about me. During my past time, I love playing and watching sport, particularly cricket. So I'm looking forward to the return of team sports in a month or so. I'm not so much looking forward to watching England. If any cricket fans are out there, you know they got spanked this morning. So I hope that turns around a little bit in the future. But otherwise, I'm also taking part in Pathway, which is Pioneer's leadership development course. So if any of you have questions about that or want to know what that looks like and its relaunch, feel free to drop me a line on Hopin. I'm under the people list as the Pioneer events team. Because I'm helping with some oversight stuff. So yeah, you may have seen me posting comments and polls and stuff. So you get to see who the name is, or the face, sorry, behind the name by being here in this seminar. So you're welcome. Our speaker for today is Paul Nation. He's already here with us. He is the head of customer care at ChurchSuite. He's actually my line manager. So I'm going to make sure I behave and I'm going to make him look good, of course, as well. So yeah, welcome to Paul. Before I do hand over to Paul to share with us this morning, I'll just let you know about a couple of things. I'm sure you've already got to grips with them a little bit, but please do feel free to make use of the chat function. If you've already said hello and where you're from, that's amazing. Do make sure you're typed at... You're on the session tab. So where there is event and session, make sure you're on session so that any comments or questions for this seminar come into here rather than the general conference as a whole. Otherwise, yeah, things might get a little confusing for you and might get lost in things. So yeah, make sure you're on the session tab so that we can all hear your questions and comments. We'd love to hear from you. Importantly, after Paul has shared with us, we're going to make plenty of space for questions. So please do make sure to use that chat function to make us aware of those, and I'll pose them to Paul when the time comes. We may even have the option to bring people into the call if we want to utilize that, now that we've discovered that feature. But yeah, I think that's all the sort of preamble I want to share with people. So without further ado, Paul, I'll hand over to yourself if that's all right.
Why don't we pray just as we get started? I'm just really mindful that the title of the webinar here of leveraging data is very easy when we talk about data that we actually take our eyes off the fact that we're talking about people first and foremost. And every person in our church database is a soul that the Lord dearly loves and longs to see in closer relationship with Him. And so I think it's good that we engage in the topic of data, but let's just take a moment just to fix our eyes on the Lord Jesus, as it says in Hebrews, the author and perfecter of our faith. Father God, just as we gather together now and we look at this topic of leveraging data for your kingdom, we want to have our eyes fixed on you. Lord, all that we do is in your service and for your glory. May we be mindful that those that you've entrusted to us in our databases, they're people that you dearly love. Help us to serve and shepherd them well. And God, would you help me just now as I share, as I communicate, help me to speak clearly, help me to explain things well. And Lord, may this be a blessing to you today. Thank you for all that you've done in our own lives up to this point. Thank you for this conference and all that you're doing in us through this conference. And we ask for more. Even though we're into the afternoon, we ask for more, Lord, more of you. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, so a big topic that we're going to be covering today, church growth, really is kind of what this is all about. Now, just a little about me. As Nathaniel said, my name is Paul Nation. I head up the customer support team for ChurchSuite. We're a UK-based church management system. In fact, lots of Pioneer churches are using ChurchSuite, so a big shout out to customers out there. Before ChurchSuite, I pastored a vineyard church down in Bournemouth here where I live. And before that, I was an accountant. And really, the content of this session emerges out of all three of those seasons of life and ministry, an underlying interest in existential and empirical numbers, in accountancy, a huge passion for discipleship and the local church, and then the many conversations that I now get to have with lots of different churches and their teams in my role with ChurchSuite. And while every church is, of course, unique, there are some common challenges and issues that affect all, namely church growth. Let me begin with a couple of questions to get us on the same page. What do we mean by church growth, and how do we measure it? And right away, I want to be really clear that I honestly believe that it's God alone who gives growth. Paul, the apostle, in 1 Corinthians 3 reminds us that neither the one who plants or the one who waters is anything, but only God who makes things grow. We are co-workers in God's service. And so we don't pursue growth for its own sake. Good growth, I think, comes through faithfulness to the gospel. But I do believe that healthy things grow. So in our sessions today, kind of as co-workers together in God's service, we're going to explore how we might better leverage data, especially the data that's possibly already in our church databases for kingdom growth. And our goal here is to have clearer insight into the health of our churches and better know whether we're growing, not just one-dimensionally, growing wide numerically, but also growing deep, making disciples of Jesus, reproducing the DNA of the gospel in people's lives, growing deep in terms of personal holiness and transformation, teaching people what it means to be a disciple of Jesus, but also creating fruit bearers in ministry, not just as it relates to the community of their church, but also in terms of social action and transformed societies in which our churches exist. And my premise for this session is rooted in that growth axiom that I used in the session bio. I believe that we need to measure what we hope to change and reproduce in people's lives. There's, of course, another well-known axiom that says that if you aim for nothing, you're bound to hit it. Well, in my experience, ministry and mission are often a bit of a frenzy of activity, but that frenzy, I think, is just pointless unless we're completely clear on what our mission is, our strategy for achieving some goals, and our processes for measuring the fruit of all that activity. Now, just to say that when I use language like measuring and tracking, I'm not talking about Big Brother watching or stalking people or invading people's privacy or heavy shepherding or seeking to control people. Just simply that effective measurement has to include some sort of baseline tracking and recording, monitoring people's behaviors and engagement as it relates to our church, so that we can measure what we hope to change and reproduce in people's lives, to measure that for individuals, but also measure that across then our entire church community and our mission effectiveness. Now, if you think about it, growth is a life change. Growth requires change. But of course, we're all familiar with people in our churches that in reality, they don't want to change. They want to stay just as they are. Thank you very much. I'm quite happy. Jesus, please don't mess with my toys. Maybe they don't realize they need to change yet, or that God wants them to change. Arguably, I think some of church activity is a bit of a triumph of image over reality, a bit like this image here of an airport travelator. People may feel like they're standing still. They may even choose to stand still, but slowly, sometimes ever so slowly, we want to continually point people towards their next steps with the church. And in doing so, help move them along in their relationship with Jesus. Now, if you think about it, helping people take next steps with Jesus requires us to first know, where are people at right now? If I gave you a map and asked you to give me directions to London, you need to know where London is on the map, and you need to know where I'm located right now. You need to know the starting point and the destination. Perhaps one of the challenges in ministry is that everyone is unique in this regard. Each person is in a different place in their journey with Jesus. And so the next steps with Jesus for one person is going to be wholly different to another person's next steps. Now, in reality, I just want to say this session isn't going to be the silver bullet to all your discipleship and leadership woes, and I'm really sorry about that. And you can ask Pioneer for a refund if you're not happy about that. No, I'm joking. But I also want to say that data doesn't equal discipleship, but data can inform discipleship. Let me say that again. Data doesn't equal discipleship. They're not the same thing, but data can inform discipleship. So my hope out of this session for each of our churches in this season of transition, and as we look forward to post-pandemic times, is that we might begin to create a blueprint of a strategy for growth, essentially a set of guiding principles that will help inform our decision-making, and also principles that we can use to evaluate what we're doing so that we can be more effective in ministry. And my first guiding principle, and perhaps a little bit controversially, is that church attendance is often overvalued. As I talk to churches around the UK, Sunday service attendance is often their main growth metric, and it's valued above all others. You know, if you get a bunch of church leaders together in a room, it's not long before someone asks the question, so how big is your church? The thing is, church attendance as a metric is problematic. Determining my church's spiritual health from our weekly attendance figures is like trying to determine my physical health from the number of online supermarket shopping deliveries that I've had in the last year. Let's say that I told you that I had 20 home shopping deliveries in the last year. On its own, that data tells you nothing about my health. You don't know whether I shopped at M&S online or McDonald's online. You don't know whether I shopped elsewhere during the year or how many takeaway meals I may have had. Perhaps I started only having home shopping deliveries quite recently, or maybe I had them at the start of the year, but since then I've stopped. You don't know what food items I had delivered or what meals I produced from them. You don't know whether I ate all the meals myself or if I used some of the ingredients to produce meals to share with others. You don't know if I've got special dietary preferences or how regularly I got my 5 a day. You don't know my portion sizes or whether there was any waste. You can't tell what my favorite foods are, or whether I tried some products once but never tried them again, or whether there are some staple foods that are always in my online basket. And I think Sunday service attendance in and of itself is just like that. I'd argue that Sunday service attendance as a metric is great at telling us about building occupancy for each of our services. And that's certainly important to know if you're approaching the upper ceiling of your available space. But those numbers tell us very little about spiritual health and growth in our churches. And the problem with church attendance is that the number actually doesn't really care about the existing people in our congregations. It only tells you if you have more or less people attending our services this year compared to last year. It doesn't tell you how many new people there were, or how many people may have left, or how many first-time visitors became repeat attenders. So I just want to be really clear. I'm not in any way knocking church attendance, and I'm certainly not even suggesting that we shouldn't continue tracking weekly attendance. I'm simply saying that attendance can't be the only metric that we rely on, or even be the primary metric that we rely on. Consider this as a question. Are the people already attending your church becoming more like Jesus? Are the people that are attending your church becoming more like Jesus? I think that is a great question to have maybe at your next staff or leader team meeting, to talk about that question. Are the people already attending your church becoming more like Jesus? Of course, one of the challenges for churches during this time of transition as we look to coming out of lockdown is that even last year, when church doors did reopen for a season, many churches found a significant portion of their congregations was still uncomfortable about meeting in person. And so as a result, online services had to continue in parallel to those managed bubble services. Arguably, the accuracy of all of that track and trace data attendance data that we had to take on the door at services last year, that was some of the best quality data that we've ever had in churches. But even that data gave an incomplete picture of church health. It was near impossible to determine growth during that time. So, long introduction, but are there more accurate ways of measuring growth and health? Well, I think that there is. Let me begin by asking you a question. What's my church truly trying to accomplish? As you think about your church, what are we truly trying to accomplish? You see, before we can decide how to measure our efforts, we first need to know what we're measuring. If we were to distill down the greatest commandment and the Great Commission, I think that we would all agree that the primary reason the church exists is to teach people to love God, to love others, and make disciples. Like, it's not rocket science, it's not a secret formula, like, it's really plain in scripture. This is our primary mission. And sure, we may phrase it, differently. Our vision statement may reflect some other values too, but at its core, our mission is to help people to love God, to love one another, and to make disciples. In other words, we exist to effect tangible change in people's lives. And the problem is that life change isn't very easy to quantify. How do you measure the state of someone's heart? And yet for years, Sunday service attendance has been the barometer for life change. We all agree that being plugged into a church community is a healthy, good thing. And it's certainly an indicator of some health in people's lives. But showing up at a church service doesn't necessarily equate to a life change. In fact, it could just as much be an indicator of something unhealthy, like passivity. I've been in small churches with consistently low attendance that have deeply nourished my soul and moved me closer to Jesus. But I've also known large churches that have done that less so. So I think we need a different basis for measuring church health and growth. And one practical way to do that is to measure growth in terms of next steps with Jesus. Measuring growth in terms of next steps with Jesus. Going back to that primary mission of our churches, that we exist to help people love God, love others, and make disciples. Each of those statements begins with a verb. And a verb demands an action. You can't love God passively. You can't love people passively. And you certainly can't make disciples passively. But what if we looked at everything that our churches do in the context of helping people actively take their next steps with Jesus? Our vision, our mission, the events and courses that we run, the services that we put on, our groups, all of our communications. What if everything were designed to help people take next steps with Jesus? Now, I'm going to talk a little bit more about next steps with Jesus in just a moment. But let me just first of all talk a little bit about our models for ministry. I wonder, 2 years ago, how would you have answered the question if somebody had said to you, how would your church accomplish its mission if in-person services weren't possible? Like, we would have been thrown by that question, wouldn't we? Certainly the COVID pandemic has forced all of us to embrace the world of online church and digital church in ways that we hadn't before. And arguably, the pandemic has accelerated and exaggerated the issue and has exposed some of our strengths and weaknesses. But even prior to the pandemic, I think our churches were a little bit imbalanced, because despite there being 168 hours in a week, historically, our model of ministry has focused mainly on the 1 hour weekend service, and it's largely neglected the other 167 hours. But even as a result of the pandemic, now the pendulum has swung, almost too far the other way. Now we're just as imbalanced because we're forced to focus almost entirely on online church service expressions. Now, I realise there's lots of uncertainty still about reopening churches and how this is all going to look in the months and the years to come. But I'm absolutely convinced that if we want to serve our churches more holistically, then in-person and online ministry is going to need to continue to exist in parallel, which does mean that we need to come to terms with the fact that one can't be a substitute for the other. I read an Instagram post recently that said this: The pandemic has forced churches to embrace digital in new ways. But unless that becomes long-term strategic change and not a temporary pivot out of necessity, all of that progress will be undone. So let's get practical. I'm a practical person. I work with Nathaniel. He'll tell you I'm a practical person. I like to think very practically. So we've already described our traditional model for ministry. Nathaniel's going to put this up on the screen for me. So at the bottom, we've got our mission, helping people to love God, love others, and make disciples. It's the why we do what we do. And the primary way of fulfilling that mission is the 1 hour Sunday service. And churches have historically invested the majority of their time and resources into that weekly live event. Essentially, in this model, the hope of accomplishing our mission hinges primarily on this service. And how do we quantify this? Well, our metric has been church attendance, counting people in seats as the barometer for growth. What if we take that same model, because I'm not suggesting we replace it. Instead, what if we built on it and made it more holistic and more relevant to the post-pandemic world that we're facing? Something that incorporates everything our churches are doing, something that will track growth in new people and our existing congregations. And importantly, we're going to make our measurement of growth more accurate. And because we want our ministry to be, our efforts to be more effective, we need accurate readings in order to tell whether what we're doing is working or not. So, clear the screen, Nathaniel. Back to the beginning, here we go. We'll start off with our mission. At the bottom, our mission, helping people love God, love others, make disciples. As I said earlier, this is the why we do what we do, and this part, it doesn't change. But next up, the how. This is where we consider not just the 1 hour Sunday service, but the full 168 hours in the week, where life change can take place online and offline. How do we quantify this? The metric, next steps with Jesus, tracking church activity and engagement all week long, not just the sitting in rows at a Sunday service. Now, how do we do this? Well, how we can do this is we can begin by making a list of every next step with Jesus that's important to your church. Now, up to now, I realize that phrase next steps, I've been a little bit ambiguous. So let me just clarify exactly what I mean. Simply stated, a next step is any action that a person takes towards loving God, loving others, and making disciples. So, Nathaniel, can you just put up my list for me? Now, just to say, this isn't an exhaustive list, but here's a bunch of next steps that we probably should be measuring as a baseline for growth in all our churches. And you'll see on my PowerPoint that I've separated them into two lists, two categories: choices on the left and practices on the right. Choices are one-time moments. They're one-time moments when people commit to moving off the sidelines into action. These are the next steps of people, of someone moving from a position of passive spectator to active participant. Now, on the right-hand side, practices, think spiritual disciplines or healthy behaviors. These represent the ongoing habits of a follower of Jesus as they relate to your church. And just to say, in the practices category, attending a church service is one of the steps that we want to encourage, but it's not the only one. Perhaps post-pandemic, you want to continue to track how many devices are viewing your online services. And so you could add that in as a next step to the practices list. Or maybe it's helpful in your context to expand the tithing and giving practice. Maybe you want to start tracking the number of online donations or the volume of online donations. And maybe add in set up recurring online giving to the choices category. This is entirely flexible. This is just an example that I'm showing you. Your church may look very different. You may value some things very differently. But essentially, we want to end up with a really clear list of all of the one-time choices and ongoing practices that are important to us. And then what we're going to do is we're going to track them over time to better measure health and growth. And what you measure will be totally unique to your church. Now, let me just point out, knowing that a person made a decision to start following Jesus is considerably more important than knowing that that same person started following you on Instagram. I hope that we'd have some agreement on that. So I wonder if it might also be helpful to assign a value, perhaps 1 to 10, to each next step based on the importance to you in your community. So the number that you assign is simply about clarifying what's important to your church in terms of health and growth. Now, not only will this help us to not treat each step equally, but it will also help us when we're reporting next steps growth or celebrating achievements or our progress towards our mission of helping people love God, love others, and make disciples. None of this is an exercise in vanity. We're not comparing ourselves to the church down the road or the big, city centre mega church. We're simply measuring and comparing our own church, week on week, month on month, year on year, gaining insights into what's working and what's not working in our church in terms of real life change. Okay, so let's move on. Let's just talk briefly about process. The processes that we're going to need to identify and track each of those next steps that we just talked about. Now, I don't want to in any way minimize or underplay the complexities involved in identifying when people take next steps and how we might gather that data consistently. What I would say, though, is if you're using a church management system, then you've likely already got many of the tools needed to gather that data digitally, either in a semi-automated or an automated way. For example, in ChurchSuite, and other platforms are available, when someone signs up for a small group or an event or a course or submits a visitor connect form digitally, either on your website or using your church app or at your church information point at an in-person service, a record of that next step is automatically added against their profile in your database. In other words, you can still be drinking your morning latte on a Monday morning and not have to do anything. That's all being done for you as people engage and interact with the different activities of your church. Now, because we want to measure growth over time, what we really need here is not simply a flag, like a tag. Not simply a flag of has somebody signed up or haven't they signed up. What we need is a date. So if you just put, thanks, Nathaniel. So here's an example of how next steps can be recorded as key dates against a person's profile in your database. So they're shown here visually at the top. There's like a visual timeline, and then underneath is the supporting data of each of those kind of different next steps. And straight away, we've got a really clear snapshot picture of where this person is at in their journey with Jesus and the church. We can see the next steps that they've already taken to date, and this information can then help inform their next steps. What I love about this as a pastor is that this gives me a much clearer picture of life change. These key dates have even been, I don't know if you can see, but they've been color-coded to distinguish between the changes that are choices and the things that are practices. Now, thinking about the parable of the lost sheep, it's great when we have 99 sheep taking lots of next steps. But this visual representation is equally helpful to me as a pastor in identifying the one sheep who hasn't engaged much. Who are the people, like this example, who seem to be disengaging over time? Who are the people that have stalled in our welcome and integration process? Who, despite our best efforts, hasn't yet taken the next step that we were hoping for them? Who signed up but didn't show up? Can you see that having next steps recorded as key dates against people's profiles can really help us to better understand where each person is at right now? Imagine if you're considering someone for leadership development. What does their key date history tell you about the next steps that they've already taken that might make them a suitable candidate for some leadership responsibility. Maybe there are some people in your community that right now actually they're being overlooked simply because they're not necessarily highly visible in church services, but actually their faithful historic engagement makes them an ideal candidate for leadership development. And because we have this quality of data at a micro level for individuals within our church, the macro level, the big picture reporting across our entire database is easily extracted and equally insightful. It allows us to report life change next steps and visualize growth over time, and then make comparisons between different time periods. One of the things that databases do really well, they're great at enabling you to be able to ask questions of your data. For example, imagine you're putting on a newcomer event and you want to invite a bunch of people. Getting a list of people who have next step key dates for first connected, say in the last 6 months, and who haven't yet got an attended newcomer event key date, that's really easy. I don't know whether you can make this out on the screen in the top right-hand corner. There are 2 questions there that are being asked. Added in the last 6 months and has not yet got a key date of having previously attended a newcomer dinner. And in this example, 32 people have come up in my church database that meet that criteria. So now I've got the basis for sending perhaps an invitation. You could send event invitations, something with simple accept, decline responses to make it easier for people to engage with your event and respond, and so that you can then track the responses in your database. And just to say, it's not just the accepts that are of interest. We can learn a lot from the decline responses too. In this example, I think there's a massive heart difference between the, in Nathaniel's case, I'm not interested in attending this event. Sorry, Nathaniel.
I saw
okay, I'm not interested in this event. Or Sally's response where she's declined saying, I'm not available to attend this event. And so how we might follow up with those 2 declinees would be entirely different. When it comes to analyzing data and those next steps, growth metrics, the goal, I think, is to perform health checks, not autopsies. And what I mean by this is having some process in place to gather life change next steps like we've just been looking at. It allows us to approach church growth evaluation from a very positive, proactive perspective. So rather than waiting a year to carry out an autopsy of how did the last year go compared to the previous year, what we really need to do is carry out more periodic health checks to see how we're doing on the go. What's working well? What's not working so well? What needs some attention? You know, it's quite normal for numbers to fluctuate on a weekly basis. But when we see, a sharp rise or a fall in next steps metrics, maybe we need to try and trace back what did we do differently at that time? What did we do that week or that month? And we need to do it in a timely manner while kind of the events are still fresh in our minds. Maybe you had an especially successful campaign that drove more volunteers to sign up to begin serving in your church, something to celebrate. Or maybe despite your very best efforts, people just didn't respond to your announcements or a social media post about an event. Perhaps it's time to try something different. Perhaps the messaging was wrong. Perhaps the timing of the event that we were plugging was wrong. Perhaps the audience we were appealing to was wrong. If a metric spikes or drops in a given month, we can use our data to pinpoint the cause, which is going to help us know where we further need to invest in, kind of terms of what's working well, or the things that maybe we just need to move on from because they're not working at all. Listen, I've talked there, I reckon, for a good 30 minutes non-stop. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop there. Nathaniel, I can't see you anymore. You seem to have disappeared. But I think what I'd really love to do, Nathaniel, if it's okay with you, is just kind of open things up to take some questions. But I hope that that's been helpful just in terms of stirring the pot. I'm not in any way setting myself up to be a church growth expert. Essentially, what I'm sharing here are my musings and observations in probably the last 30 years of ministry and leadership, and some of the things that I've seen and used that have worked well and things that haven't worked so well. This has kind of come out of all of that. But maybe this is helpful as we begin to think, are we going to do things the way we always did them when we come out of lockdown? Or are we going to, do something different and try something different and approach this kind of new reality post-COVID differently? So I hope that that's been helpful just to stimulate some conversation. So over to you, Nathaniel.
Great. Thanks so much for sharing with Paul. I hope you can see me now. I'm not quite sure what's going on there, but yeah, that was already great. I mean, a lot of coming out of lockdown, and as we move to maybe a distribution between online and in-person services, it gives us another opportunity to reevaluate these things, and it's really helpful challenge to think about where that data has just been data to us before. Actually, these are people that we love, and we know Jesus loves, and we want to serve them and see them get to know him more and deepen their relationship with him. So yeah, I really enjoyed that. And I'm not just saying that because you're my line manager, but I generally enjoyed it from a perspective of church and how data ties into all that. As Paul says, we'd love to open up a bit of a time now for some questions. I've got a few ready to sort of spike things off or to start things off. But if you have any questions, do type them in the chat for the session, or maybe ask to join. I think you need to share audio and visuals, and you can join us right here and ask a question live if you have a camera or not. Oh, we've got someone who's joined us already. That's amazing. So we probably don't need to go into my questions, but I'll start with Sarah because I think her question came through first, and then we'll move on to Verena. And she's going to join us on video. But so Sarah asks, in order to use new people's data for metrics, at what point have you captured their initial data and have asked for their consent? Are you exclusively
Okay, I think I understand the question there. I think this is really about GDPR, and that's a really valid consideration. One of the things I love about the GDPR is, for the first time certainly in UK legislation, we've actually now got something that really puts the interests of the data subject front and center and gives them, empowers them with some rights. But also very well worked into the GDPR is lots of scope for data controllers, in other words, the church. I like to think that the Holy Spirit is very much in Article 6, subsection 2 of the GDPR. How nerdy am I to even know that? But I spend a lot of time reading the GDPR. And so that article in the GDPR is all about legitimate interest. And for organizations like churches that are processing special category data, so obviously the data in your church database is considered special category because it reflects or might reflect somebody's religious views. So it's considered special category. It's afforded some extra protections. But for churches, the legitimate interest gives us lots of scope for being able to do reporting and things like that. In terms of the level of personal data, I think this is absolutely where we need to be looking at our privacy notice to make sure that it is well worded and suitable for what we want to do with people's data. You see, if people think that their data is going to be sold on the internet to Cambridge Analytica, they're going to be untrusting of us and they will be unwilling to give us their information. On the other hand, if we're very transparent up front and explain what we're doing as an organization, if that's a regular part of our rhetoric, from our platforms at weekend services and in our communications, that we, use data, then I think, and they understand what data is being used and how it's being used and the scope of that, and that we're not going to take somebody's date of birth and use it to sing them happy birthday on a Sunday morning at church, embarrass them or something. I think if people know how it's going to be used, they will trust us. So there is a sense that we need consent for some information, but actually a lot of information that we gather in churches may be able to fall under the category of legitimate interest. So consent is one of only 6 examples of lawful basis. Sorry, one of 6 lawful bases for processing data. There are 5 others. So we don't need, and neither should we ask for consent if that's not appropriate. Let me give just an example to illustrate that. So small group attendance is a great one that I often get asked about. Is it, appropriate to record small group attendance? Now, I would say as a pastor, knowing small group attendance is incredibly helpful if I'm wanting to grow my small group ministry. If I want to identify groups that are flourishing or groups that are struggling, if I want to identify, groups that say they've got, 20 people in their group, but actually just because people sign up doesn't necessarily mean they show up and they only get 8 people each week, well, that group has actually got more capacity to be able to take some new people potentially. So I do want to gather small group attendance in my church, and I would be very transparent with group members. Now, my lawful basis for doing that is I'm not going to ask people's consent. I could do, but then what do I do if somebody says, no, I don't want you to record my attendance? Well, now we can't include you in the group member list. Now we can't, so that we don't inadvertently record your attendance. I think that actually when it comes to small group attendance, we have a lawful basis for processing as a legal obligation for safeguarding. It is entirely possible that our small groups may have vulnerable adults at risk, people with mental health issues. We may have under 18s present. We may have the very elderly or disabled. There could be all sorts of people. And the leaders of the group and the others in the group may not necessarily know that those people are vulnerable. But the very nature of church as a community is that we will attract the vulnerable as well as the not vulnerable. And for that reason, I think that we do need to put some measures in place, like recording small group attendance, so that we have got our leaders' backs. But we can then also ask to use that data for the purposes of how's my small group ministry going? And that's where legitimate interest comes in. We also have a legitimate interest there. And it doesn't require people's consent. I think the signing up, though, for an event, signing up for a discipleship course, if I'm a new person visiting your church and I'm submitting my details for the first time, yes, absolutely, I think that probably is consent. And I would only fill in the boxes that I feel comfortable filling in. And at the bottom of the form before I submit it, I'm presumably going to be asked to do some sort of, I've read, understood, and accept your, terms and conditions, your privacy notice. So in that respect, you are gathering consent. Have I answered the question that was asked there?
I think you very much answered the first part of the question, definitely. The other part was just a bit more about the mechanics of it. So she mentioned Church Connect. That might be the Connect area of ChurchSuite, the software obviously we offer out. But are there, those mechanisms for it? Would that be just verbal?
I think that
be using something
when
like,
we're wanting to add people's data to our databases, we need to make sure we're doing that in a compliant way. So even if, say, Nathaniel, I took you out for a coffee and I'm looking to, get you to come along to an alpha course or something, and I say to you, oh, Nathaniel, could I just take a few contact details? I can then just pass that on to the church, and they will then follow up with you. Or maybe I'm a staff member for the church, and I think, I'll just add Nathaniel into the database. Even that needs to be done in a compliant way. And I wonder if the best way to do that is to use the same data subject facing functionality that we might have on our website. So where we invite people to go to the website to connect if they're looking for a church to join, or maybe we help people connect to our church information point. Those two places should also be available to our staff when they're out and about in the community talking to people, or also perhaps even made available to small group leaders, or maybe the likes of me, where I'm having the conversation with Nathaniel in the coffee shop, rather than me adding Nathaniel's data on my phone to my device. Maybe a more compliant thing, and speaks much more about how much I value Nathaniel and his data, is I might say to Nathaniel, hey, look, why don't I just call up the church website? Here's my phone, Nathaniel. Why don't you type in your details, tick the box that says I'm interested in the alpha course, and then one team will follow up. How does that sound? And I think that as a type of people process is far more honouring. What I also like about that as well is, by me giving my phone to Nathaniel to type in his details, is I no longer need the spiritual gift of deciphering Nathaniel's handwriting to try and work out what he's put on. He can type it in himself. And I think that also can help church admin officers as well. That answered the question, Daniel.
Well, Yeah, I think that's great. And also it ties in, you mentioned earlier about GDPR, and with having systems that allow you to take that data straight in, it means that it's not there available perhaps on people's phones. Like when you say you're passing me your phone, it's on the website, they're not going into your phone book. So it saves that sort of level of data being stored in maybe the wrong places.
Thank you.
Sarah's great answer. So yeah, I think we got that one pretty good. Brilliant. Vanessa's asked a question, but I think Verena, we're going to give it a go to invite you into the call. Chris did this earlier, so I hope this works and you're ready to join us, because we obviously just answered that question. But Verena, I'm adding you now.
I think she'll probably have to.
Hopefully you can join us. Video. I've clicked the button.
Hey, this works.
Hello. I actually didn't have a question.
Hey, there's Verena. Welcome.
But I thought we would all join you see. That was great that everybody was going to join. Look, I'm nice and I've got a halo. I'm in glory. But now that you've been talking, I actually do have a question. So while I'm on here, because you should ask everybody else to join so we can see who's there.
It all works out. Go for it.
We can only have like one or two people in the room at a time.
Oh, I see.
We can only have like one or like a few people in the room at a time, so we can't get everyone.
I'm just starting out with ChurchSuite. I tried to get onto it just before the pandemic hit, and then of course everything stopped, so I haven't done it. So this is my next thing now, because I'm now actually the administrator. So I have to start this all over again. And I mean, it all sounds rather daunting to me, particularly the whole legal side of things, with what you've just been talking about. So, but I mean, I know that you've got this trial package for ChurchSuite. So, I mean, what would your advice be to someone like me who is literally at the very beginning of this journey, which, can be rather daunting? I mean, we've obviously managed to get ourselves online and everything, but this whole data thing at the moment is still prehistoric. Well, not quite prehistoric.
Yeah.
We've got some stuff, but we haven't got an online system yet. So,
Verena,
there must be other people like me around.
I'm sure, yeah. Verena, lovely to meet you, first of all. Thanks very much for asking your question. And I hope other than saying at the very beginning that I work for ChurchSuite, this seminar is not intended to be it's not an advertisement for ChurchSuite, and neither is it a ChurchSuite. It's not a kind of a technical support line either for ChurchSuite. So I want to be really clear on that. Verena, I would really encourage you. I think there is definite value in having a church management system. And it's really important that you find the one that is right for your church. I would definitely involve lots of people in that decision making, not just, it sounds as though you're probably one of the primary people that would be using it, but actually
well, there are other people, and we have been discussing it with other people, so that I originally tried to start it all.
Yeah, so let me just
had an approval this morning from our worship leader. We should go with ChurchSuite.
Okay.
Because he was trying to get another system, but there's so many different things to consider, isn't there?
There are indeed, absolutely. So yeah, what I'd like to do is just try and answer generally rather than doing a sort of a ChurchSuite question, if I may. I think involve lots of people in that decision-making process. Choose the system that works for you. And the only way you can do that is perhaps to begin by looking at maybe some of those things that I talked about in the session today about next steps with Jesus. I'm sure in your church expression, there are some next steps with Jesus and next steps with your church that you would love for your existing congregation and potential new people coming towards your church to take. And so thinking about what tools do we need in order to do that well. So, arguably, there are some things you can do with just simple spreadsheets. Like, you don't need to have elaborate systems for that. From experience, though, I'm not sure how GDPR compliant we are when we start messing around with just spreadsheets. So I think there is wisdom in looking at a purpose-built tool that has got kind of GDPR compliance built in and privacy and security by design, but also something that enables your team to work collaboratively. That's been so important during lockdown. You know, gone are the days where we can just go into the church office and use the computer there. We're all having to work remotely. And so being able to access our database securely from remote locations, that's seemingly become really important. You also want something that is easy to use, something that actually isn't going to create you more work than you already had, but actually is going to, over time, once you've learned how to use the thing, is actually going to make your job easier. But I think also that sometimes in churches, we also need to be making sure that we've got right people in right roles, and that we've got, you know, it would be unfair to take somebody who, you know, isn't, you know, good with computers and expect them to do a computer role. It's the same way that you wouldn't take somebody who's, you know, a rubbish preacher and ask them to go and stand on the stage and preach. So I think we need to make sure that we've, you know, got the right people. There is no benefit in taking on a church management system if you haven't got people that have got, first of all, the inclination, but the time to be able to learn how to use it. But if it's a good system, it shouldn't be too difficult. It wouldn't be difficult to learn. So, yeah, Verena, listen, it's lovely to meet you. Thank you very much for asking your question. I'm just mindful that there are others that are wanting to ask questions as well. If you've got a ChurchSuite specific question, Verena, email in, and one of the team, probably Nathaniel, would be really delighted to help you.
Yeah, I've probably spoken to you before, yeah.
Lovely to meet you.
Thank you very much.
God bless. Bye-bye.
Well, yeah. Thank you, Verena. Yeah, certainly do feel free. We have a couple more questions that have come through. Some are fairly ChurchSuite specific, and there are some that are more generic. We might briefly answer the ChurchSuite ones, but the heart here is to talk about sort of the general topic.
I'm not wearing a ChurchSuite t-shirt. I've taken my superhero outfit on. I'm wearing my club uniform. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Certainly. So yeah, as Paul says, feel free to, on our website, you can find our email on there. And as he said, I might answer your email. I do try and keep an eye out for Pioneer churches when they're contacting in to try and help out. I help everyone out, but when I see a Pioneer church come in, I do like to try and help where I can. So particularly Vanessa, the question you ask is probably one for that email route, if that's all right. We'll be happy to answer any questions through there. I'll put the email in the chat in a minute for our support line to, if you want to copy them and paste that down. But Sally has put in a question I think we can cover. So to implement the event timelines you were showing for individuals, how can you practically gather all the event data required? Do all events have to be in the system and signed up for? Does someone end up spending a lot of time entering data?
So the premise here is that your church management system already has your events and courses. For example, let's take an example of an Alpha course. That already exists in your calendar for people to be able to register for and sign up for. All that I'm saying is, what if we took that sign up information, so the people that sign up to come along to Alpha, what if we then took that information and saved that as a key date against those people's profile? So that should, in a good church management system, that should just be a button click exercise. That shouldn't be something that requires lots of time to actually enter. What we want to be doing actually is, rather than collecting Alpha signups on a clipboard and then having the manual task of entering stuff, what we want to do is have it on our website, have it at our church information point, have it on your church app, so that people can see what's coming up in the church calendar. Maybe they've heard about the Alpha course being plugged in the communications or from the platform, and so they click through and they sign up themselves. And that, in a sense, they're doing the admin work for you. You're having to do very little in that regard. Even when somebody is a newcomer, and obviously newcomers rarely connect with you the very first time they visit. They probably visit a few times. But if you've got a really good, proactive, friendly welcome team that are actively looking for the new people, and they're, kind of pressing for, oh, you're new here today, lovely to meet you, and oh, we'd love to send you some information, perhaps a welcome pack, or we'd love to invite you to, Costa Coffee newcomer event, or whatever it might be that you do in your context. To make it very easy for people to be able to sign up or submit their details And part of submitting their details is not just giving you their name and their email address or their mobile number. It might also be that you have got some other questions on the form that they're completing that they may feel happy about answering. You may want to ask them questions about their next steps, asking, how did you hear about the church? Where are you at in your journey with Jesus right now? I mean, there are all sorts of questions that we can ask people. It's entirely optional whether people answer them, but actually we can serve people better with that information coming straight into our database from the form that they've just filled in. So I don't know whether I've answered Graham's question there, but I don't think that any of these require lots of work, certainly not in terms of the church office having to do stuff. This is about identifying the things we want to measure, and then setting up the processes in our church management system and communicating to everybody on the team, this is what we want to do. So if, for example, the metric that you value most is people who have given their life to Jesus, how do you do that in your church? Let's not assume that everybody gives their life to Jesus just on an Alpha course. That might be one of the places, though, where you want to make sure you've got some process in place so that you're gathering that information at the point of your Alpha course. But what if I'm praying with somebody after church on a Sunday morning and I end up leading them to Jesus? How do I know what you want me to do with that life event? Like something amazing just happened. Make sure that I know what to do about that. Maybe there's a little form I fill out to say, I led Nathaniel Alsop to Jesus this morning, and I gave him a Bible, and I've agreed to meet with him for a coffee this week. I don't know what the processes are in your church, but identify all of those places where you need some process, just so that there's consistency, so that something doesn't fall through the cracks. Do your small groups leaders know that if somebody gives their life to Jesus in small group, that that's useful to pass on, not just to hold on to in the group, but actually the recording of that life event, that Nathaniel gave his life to Jesus, into the church database against his record. That's really easy to do. That's not lots of work at all. I hope I've answered Graham's question there.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, confirmation. You have answered it. Great stuff. Brilliant. We've got 1 or 2 more minutes before we get to 1:30, and that's kind of the end, more or less, of the session. We don't have any other questions at the moment in the chat. If anyone's got some quick last ones, feel free to put in the chat or join our queue to actually join us in the call.
Nathaniel, I've talked a lot today. Probably for most of us, we were thinking in the context of adults. But could I also say that let's take all of this into our children and youth ministry as well, because their journey with Jesus and your church begins there as well.
Yeah, really.
And so their list of key dates, if that's how you record life events and next steps with Jesus, their key dates start in their, as when they're babies, children, coming to alternative Halloween parties or coming to a youth guest service or whatever it might be. They also give their lives to Jesus before 18. We want to make sure we record those life events. And then when they become adults, all of that history, all of that amazing journey they've been on comes with them as well. So this is for youth and children ministry. So sorry, I've now taken the adult workflow and I've multiplied it by 3 because now it's children and it's youth. I'm sorry about that, but I think that's really important.
Yeah, no, that's great. I'm really glad you covered that to help with all different kinds of data and the people who are involved in the church. Jesus loved the children as well as the adults, and he invited them to be with him as well. So that's great. One last question, I think, from Tanya in the chat. She says, training of leadership team to understand what the data is actually saying. I guess she's asking kind of how would you go about training those people in your leadership teams when you've got this data in your systems?
This is
such, how do you then train them to interpret it and use
this is such a skilled area of being able to communicate well in our teams. Not just imparting information, but actually casting vision to our leadership teams as well. Arguably, we need to do that more effectively with our leadership teams than we do with the church. It sometimes feels easier to cast vision to the church but our leadership teams, they're our key stakeholders. They're the ones that we want to onboard and get on side and get them understanding and appreciating what it is we're trying to achieve. And I do think with these types of life change events, next steps with Jesus, we do need to help everybody. I mean, the kind of analyzing of data or looking at somebody's profile page and making a determination about whether they might be suitable for leadership development or not, or teaching a pastor how to click into somebody's profile page to look at their key date journey, or to look up their historic small group attendance, or to run a report. That's a training thing, that comes under the thing. And I don't have it. There's not a button that you can click in your database that does that training for you. But I do think some things to think about are talking about this regularly. This isn't a one-time thing that you do. Rolling out technology in churches and dealing with that in an ongoing basis. You don't just do that once. You do it time and again, and it gets easier to do. Each turn of the wheel is easier, but arguably the first turn of the wheel is the hardest. But it's constantly reinforced and written down as well, and passed on, so that when new people join team, that information is made available to them. I like, one of the things we do on our team, I work with Nathaniel, for those of you that missed that bit earlier, is we have how-to documents that we share among the team, so that when somebody new joins the team, they get a how-to document on a topic, or if they're not sure about how to do something, they go to the how-to documents to look up. Like, we've got that really clear sense of communicated, this is what we do, this is how we do it, this is why we do it, and if you've got a question, this is who you go to. Like, that is all super clear in our team. And I think if we could bring that more into our church teams, that might help. I don't know whether I answered Tanya's question there or not.
I think it has. Brilliant stuff. Yeah. Oh, and we've got a few rounding out chats, so I think that's probably a good time to bring it to a close there. I'm so thankful that you all have been able to join us for our seminar this afternoon. I hope you have enjoyed what Paul has had to share. It's definitely given me even some stuff to go away and chew on, and I know from the comments that a number of people feel the same way. For anyone who is wanting to access this seminar back, it will be made available after the conference, along with any of the other seminars that I've gone on during this slot and everything else that's going on during the conference. So you can always catch up and replay any of that stuff there if that's something you want to really digest and chew on with the rest of your team. As I said, if you want to contact us about ChurchSuite, you're more welcome to check us out on our website and drop an email. We'd always be glad to help you with that there. But for the time being, I think that's a good place to round it out. So, Paul, would you be
Heavenly
okay
Father,
to pray
thank you for
this
time together, just to get some stuff out of the box and look at it and talk about it. And Lord, I ask that you, by your Holy Spirit, would just bring some inspiration and illumination into all that stuff as we kind of process what we've been hearing about today. May we not kind of get overwhelmed by having to think about how do I understand this data? How do I analyze it? Like, may that not be something that's overwhelming. Lord, may you be the one that brings illumination. Actually, all of this is about, we just want to walk in step with you. So as we go into the remainder of our day, would you walk with us, Lord Jesus, we pray. Amen. Amen.
Amen. Awesome stuff. Thank you once again, Paul, for joining us and sharing us. Thank you, everyone in the chat, for contributing and bringing your questions. And yeah, we hope you enjoy the rest of the conference for the rest of the weekend.